Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is terror. The terror that struck Paris and that is certainly waiting to strike other parts of Europe. I am obviously thinking about it and how it touches the Jewish community, or better, the various Jewish communities. I'm still thinking about the terror that rocked France. I can think of little else. I expect that I will continue to be consumed by these events and continue to analyze the terror and the events leading up to the attacks and responses to the terror that shook Paris for a long time to come. Of course, I'm thinking about how to best respond. How do we respond as individuals and as leaders and as influencers and even as thinkers? We need to know how to advise our diplomats and dignitaries on how to respond, and we should certainly make certain that we make things better and not worse. We cannot excuse the terror, and we must know that in almost every circumstance, the terror had an anti-Western and an anti-Semitic component to it. In some cases, the terror is totally motivated by anti-Semitism. On the central question of terror and the response, one should note that in Paris, there were multiple terrorist attacks. Charlie Hebdo, the Hyper Kasher, the Jewish supermarket, the kosher supermarket, they were the main terror events. But there was also the standoff, the hostage-taking, the murder of the policewoman. There was also the murder of the jogger the day before, all done by the same people. And there was an ongoing investigation about a potential attack on the Jewish girls' school, the plans for which were discovered in the car of the terrorists. I hesitate to compare the terror attacks perpetrated in France to the 9/11 terror attacks, but I must. Obviously, 9/11 was more horrific and more dastardly. 9/11 set the tone for events to come. It was our first colossal terror attack perpetrated by Islamic terrorists. It was the first such attack to rock and to shock the Western world. It was more of everything. It was an attack that stunned the United States. And this was a 9/11 moment for France. And the pain and fear that overtook France was shared by the rest of the Western world. These terror attacks are a challenge to the democratic core of French culture, a heritage that dates back to the French Revolution. More than that, and worse than that, the terror gave voice to the Muslim immigrant community in France that does not want to assimilate. For generations, the secret to acceptance into France was assimilation. The secret quickly learned by every other immigrant community was that to become French, you had to learn French, and you had to speak with an authentic French accent. You had to become French. The Muslim community is different now. Not only do they have no interest in blending in, no interest in embracing French culture, there's a major component of the Muslim community that actually wants to change France. Instead of becoming more French, they want France to become more like them. And interestingly, part of French diplomatic history and foreign affairs has always been to bend over backwards in order to make an effort not to offend the Muslims in their midst. The French were the backbone of the Arabists in diplomacy. It was they who would regularly articulate the Muslim point of view to the West. And it was the French who would often call Israel to task for this and for that and side with the Palestinians. As recently as weeks ago, just a few weeks ago, in the vote taken by the United Nations Security Council on the creation of a Palestinian state, France gave the big resounding "we" to the resolution. That is enormously important. So it was no surprise that Haaretz, the Israeli daily paper of record, sent out a screeching alert that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was going to Paris to participate in a mass rally that was planned, that the Israeli Prime Minister would be marching along in defiance of the terrorism and standing in support of the fight against terror by honoring the 17 French victims, 4 of whom were Jews. Actually, 6 were Jews, but 4 were murdered in the kosher supermarket. The kicker is that French President Hollande, François Hollande, did not want the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to attend the rally. Netanyahu went anyway, and the leaders came to an understanding. But Abbas, the president of the PA, was invited in order to lend balance to Netanyahu's presence. Hollande had serious cause for asking Netanyahu to keep out of his rally. He was concerned that the presence of both Netanyahu and PA President Abbas might steal the show away. He thought that the spotlight would shine on them and the lack of progress in their negotiations towards peace, overshadowing the raison d'etre for the rally itself. He knew that Netanyahu would arrive with a very large delegation and a very large security team, making the rally very difficult to manage security-wise. And then there was the question of dual loyalties. With the threat of terror hanging over the heads and alarming rampant rise of anti-Semitism throughout France, Netanyahu has been calling on French Jews to move to Israel. This is a direct offense to the French, who do not yet see the threat as substantial. Actually, the tension continued even during the visit. When Netanyahu got up to speak, Hollande got up and left the synagogue at the memorial for the 4 victims. Sure, there were affairs of state that needed to be handled, but just before the event began, French Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who parenthetically is actually married to a Jewish woman, was to sit next to Netanyahu and Hollande. As he moved towards his place in the synagogue, one of Bibi's security team intercepted him and stopped him aggressively. Prime Minister of France Valls responded saying in French and English, quote, "You do not make the rules here. You provide security for the Prime Minister of Israel, and that's all," unquote. There's more. Hollande and his advisors do not believe that terror in Israel can be paralleled to the terror they face in France. The French government maintains that in Israel, terror is understandable. It is political, and therefore, in their eyes, it is almost justified. In France, the terror is Islamic. Netanyahu speaks about the Western world working together to confront these threats. France decidedly disagrees. In the end, thankfully, all the fears were groundless, and how would it look if the Prime Minister of Israel announced that he was going to France and then changed his plans? How would it look if he was not at a rally in honor of 4 Jews who were brutally murdered in the kosher market and now buried in Israel? I'll tell you how it would look. It would look far worse than if the President or Vice President of the United States was not there. Following up, in the week after the terror in Paris, when France was thrown into the throes of a series of Muslim terror attacks, a new set of threats has enveloped the country. In the course of 1 week, 19,000 French websites have been attacked and hacked by cyber terrorists. Muslim cyber terrorists have initiated a full-court press on the internet, disrupting and destroying normal internet activity. President François Hollande is trying to bring a sense of calm back to the country after the terror strikes. He has addressed the Muslim community. He has reassured them that they are welcome, that France respects them, that France respects Islam. Hollande said, quote, "France is a friend, but it is a country that has rules, principles, and values. One of them is not negotiable: freedom and democracy," unquote. He's really speaking about the Republic. Hollande is trying to strike a balance, using words, not actions. He hopes to convince the 5 million Muslims living in France that they need to fight for democracy. In this effort, I believe that Hollande will be successful, but it is not peace-loving Muslims who are the problem. And that's the problem France must deal with. Netanyahu spoke with French leadership, and he invoked French Jewish leadership, you should note, and he invoked the teachings of his father, the historian of Spanish Jewry, Ben Sion. He said that Jews of Spain did not leave in time. They were convinced that things were not so bad. The Israeli Prime Minister implored the Jews of France to make Aliyah. Local leaders were incensed. They were insulted, but also they expected it. France today is not Spain before 1492 when the Inquisition or the expulsion. France is not Germany on the eve of the Holocaust and the rise of Hitler. The anti-Semitism is worrisome and needs to be addressed. But let's make certain that we address it with very dangerous topic. This is a very dangerous topic with the proper perspective. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is a column by Shmuel Rosner in the New York Times. It was published on January 16th, 2015. Rosner is a political editor in the Jewish Journal in LA. As an aside and a disclaimer, they often run my columns. He was the chief U.S. correspondent for Haaretz for many years. Rosner is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, and he is a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute. I've used a column of his in the past on this program, and I expect that I will refer to him again in the future. Rosner is very thoughtful and always is worth reading. The column is called, "Do France's Jews Have a Future?" His answer is a flat no. And the response should be to go live in Israel. I was surprised because Rosner seems to echo Netanyahu and the talking points from Israel, a surprise from Rosner who hardly toes the line. He begins his essay by saying, "There is a great irony to Israel's instinctive response to terror on the Jews in Europe, and the devastating attack last week on the kosher grocery store in Paris was no different. Pack your belongings," he writes, "flee, escape. Israel urges the Jews of France. A government that never misses an opportunity to lecture the Western world about the pitfalls of surrounding terrorism is proposing exactly that, surrender to the Jews of France. The state of Israel is your home," unquote. So that's how he begins the essay. Rosner makes his way through a series of arguments, including the immense military buildup around Jewish communities and the fact that 4 of the dead were buried in Jerusalem. Rosner then concludes by flatly agreeing with the Aliyah message. He writes, quote, "If the only way for Jews to live in France today is behind barracks and guards with guns, perhaps it makes more sense not just for the dead to go to Israel, but for the living to move to a place where we are the guards and we are the army and we are the government," unquote. Second up is a piece from the National Review Online and is by Rich Lowry. Rich is the editor of the National Review, which is by far the most articulate neoconservative media outlet on the web. He is a product of Virginia, born in Arlington and went to UVA, University of Virginia. After graduating, he was a research assistant for the great Charles Krauthammer, and then moved over to be with William Buckley at the National Review. This piece was syndicated on January 16th, 2015. Lowry begins, "It's settled. The Paris attacks had almost nothing to do with Islam," he writes, and then continues. "Consider that on the one hand you have the chilling videotape of the Charlie Hebdo attackers declaring, 'We have avenged the Prophet Muhammad,' and on the other hand you have the tortured assurances of White House spokesman Josh Earnest. Which are you going to believe?" Lowry shows how ludicrous it sounds to not mention Islam in dealing with this and so many other terror attacks, including Boko Haram, as he slaps at the White House at every possible opportunity. His most poignant hit at the administration is about their conference that the White House is organizing in response to the terror in Paris. The conference is called A Summit on Countering Violent Extremism. Lowry asks, quote, "Who are these extremists?" unquote. Lowry continues. He concludes the whole essay with this very powerful point. Quote, "There is a broad war of ideas within Islam between forces of reaction and violence and the forces of moderation and modernity. The threat of radical Islam won't diminish until that war is won, no matter how much the U.S. government wants to obscure it with its verbal fog machine." Unquote. I love that expression, verbal fog machine. This piece stands on its own. It was one of dozens of columns written since the Paris terror attack, questioning the administration. Note that the tone is respectful and courteous. These discussions must always maintain a level of civilized debate. The final column today is from the New York Times. It was published on January 14th, 2015 by Mustafa Akyol. Akyol is a Turkish journalist and a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times, exactly the same position that Shmuel Rosner holds. He is a columnist in the Turkish press and a commentator and a public speaker here in the United States. He often speaks for TED. This piece is entitled, "Islam's Problem with Blasphemy." Akyol begins by trying to say, quote, "Will moderate Muslims finally speak up against their militant co-religionists?" People around the world have asked, but as in the past have not seriously examined this question. Since last week's horrific attacks on the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo and on the kosher supermarket in Paris. Akyol continues, "In fact, Muslim statesmen, clerics, and intellectuals have added their voices to the condemnation of terror by leaders around the world, but they must undertake another essential task, address and reinterpret Islam's traditional take on blasphemy or insult to the sacred." Akyol explains some very interesting points about Islam, but hits home with one essential point that must be explained by Islamic leaders. Quote, "The Quran decrees no earthly punishment for blasphemy or apostasy, the abandonment or renunciation of the faith, a related concept. Nor," he continues, "for that matter, does the Quran command stoning, female circumcision, or a ban on fine arts. All these doctrinal innovations, as it were, brought into the literature of Islam as medieval scholars interpreted it, also consider blasphemy a crime." Unquote. Wow, that is powerful. I wish that it came from a Muslim cleric and not a New York Times columnist. I've been saying the same thing for years. Unfortunately, I know that we will not hear from many Islamic leaders about this subject of blasphemy, and that is a shame. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. The first cartoon is by Darren Bell. Bell is a social and political and cultural commentator. In his words, he says, he, quote, "makes fun of everything to tell the dynamic stories of people bold enough and secure enough to challenge preconceptions," unquote. He also writes comic strips, Canterville, and Rudy Park, which unfortunately you should note, comic strips are dying media. So few papers run strips now, and if they do, if they still run strips, there are fewer and fewer strips. Comic strips are on the way out. You could still find them, these comic strips, online. This particular cartoon has a black man in front of a walk-in freezer. On his hoodie, he's wearing a hoodie, is a crescent moon and star of Islam, and his name, El Bathili. On top of the cartoon is the message: "One Muslim man saved more people than 3 Muslim terrorists killed," unquote. The word Muslim is in quotes referring to the terrorists. Bell is describing the Muslim worker from Mali named Lassana Bathili, who worked in the kosher supermarket. Bathili hid and saved 12 people. His actions were heroic. He hid them in the dairy freezer, and then after the terrorists threatened to kill all the hostages upstairs, if those downstairs did not come up, 2 hostages decided to leave the freezer and go upstairs. Bathili went out the back emergency exit. He gave the police a drawing of the supermarket and the keys to the doors, so they did not have to break in. This aided the SWAT team. Bathili was a true hero, and the French bestowed upon him citizenship. He was not a citizen. Now he is, because of his bravery and his courage. Bathili is a devout Muslim who even prays in the kosher market, where he says everyone gets along. The second cartoon is from Der Standard in Vienna, Austria. It was published December 31st, 2014. It's by Oliver. It's a year-end message. The cartoon has two panels, one on top of the other. The top panel reads, "The Arab Spring on the tree with booming leaves, pyramids and mosques and churches in the background." The lower panel has the tree all withered, and in a black background, it's dead, and the letters that spelled out Arab Spring are littered on the ground. The only letters, IS, are still on the tree. Olivier's message is clear as day. The Arab Spring gave way to ISIS. IS stands for the Islamic State. That is what they call themselves. Sad, but true. The next cartoon is by Jeff Danziger. It was published on January 16th, 2015. I've used Danziger before, so we are repeating some artists. I'm also going to repeat on my next artist, Signe Wilkinson. It's okay to repeat, especially because these cartoonists are so talented and their message is so well crafted. This cartoon really strikes a nerve. The title of the piece is called "Blogger in Saudi Arabia Sentenced to 1,000 Lashes." A man is on the table being flogged. 3 men stand around, and one, with a book in his hand entitled Sharia, says to the other 2, "I'd love to stay, but I'm late for a beheading." Of course, Sharia law is Islamic law. This cartoon is highlighting the ridiculous nature of the punishments in Saudi Arabia. 1,000 lashes? That's crazy. For what? For blogging? In this case, they are lashing a blogger 50 lashes per week every Friday until they reach 1,000, and then he still has to serve out his prison term. The next cartoon is drawn by Signe Wilkinson. I mentioned her earlier, and was published on January 18th, 2015. There are only a few female cartoonists, and Signe is one of them. She has a certain style and a certain eye about her critique. This cartoon is a panorama of people, from left to right: a news editor, a Muslim, the Pope, a Hasidic Jew, a female Wicca or witch, and finally, on the far right, a reader of the news. The editor shouts out an order: remove anything offensive. Each of the players just snips and snips and snips at the news. The final person reading the newspaper holds up a paper, and it's simply a frame with nothing in it. Everything has been cut out. Wilkinson's point is well taken. Everyone wants to censor and edit. They want to edit stories that may offend, and so they try to be sensitive. In the end, that may lead to having no news at all. The next cartoon is by Glenn McCoy. It was published on January 8th, 2015, and this cartoon makes fun of the liberal media that really isn't covering the terror in Paris as honestly as it should. A soldier, or really a cartoonist, is in a foxhole. Sandbags are around him that read free speech, and his weapon is a fountain pen, and it reads French cartoonists. There are bombs exploding all around. Running away is another soldier who throws his weapon, and written on his rear end is PC media, politically correct media. As all this is happening, the soldier in the foxhole with the pen says, quote, "It's heartening to know that we're in this together." What a powerful jab at the media, who never even posted or printed the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. Now the original cartoons were not very interesting, and in the end, they themselves had very little elements of relevance. However, they caused the terror. The terrorists acted because of them. So these cartoons are part of the story. They should have been printed. People should not have had to go to other websites to see them. The point is well taken. The PC media was afraid of Muslim terrorists. The final cartoon is by Glenn McCoy again. This is a very important cartoon that needs introduction. There were almost as many cartoons lampooning President Obama as there were criticizing the Muslim terrorists. Literally every day, hundreds of cartoons have been published teasing Obama about not calling Islam radical or terrorist Islamic. This cartoon has Obama hugging a radical Islamic terrorist. The terrorist is draped with skulls, a grenade, knives, an RPG. Written on him are 2 words, radical Islam. Obama is singing as he hugs, and he hugs the terrorist, and what's he singing? "You've Got a Friend," which is, of course, Carole King's 1971 huge hit from her album Tapestry. In a moment, my own perspective and a few ideas. I want to think out loud for you right now. Recently, Israel hit Hezbollah targets in Syria on the border with Israel, situated on the Golan Heights. The target was 2 SUVs. In each SUV were 6 people, 6 Hezbollah in one vehicle, 6 Iranians in the other. They were traveling together in tandem in the northern part of Quneitra. They were a mere 7 miles from the Israeli border. One of the dead was the leader of Hezbollah's strategy on the Golan Heights, Jihad Mughniya. He was the son of one of the most important leaders of Hezbollah, their chief strategist, Imad Mughniya, who was killed in 2008. Some say that the father, too, was killed by Israel. But the list of potential sponsors for that assassination, the assassination of Mughniya Sr., is very long, and it includes Saudi Arabia. Another of the dead was an Iranian general. Iran has confirmed his death. This is very important because it allows for an important analysis and conclusion. Will Hezbollah launch a large-scale retaliation against Israel in response for this attack? No, they will not. They will not do it, though last week Hezbollah proclaimed that they were prepared to attack Israel. They may do some small responses, but they can't, and we will not expect a large reaction. Why not? Because Iran supplied Hezbollah with tens of thousands of rockets to respond when Israel launches an attack on Tehran. They are not to be used now. In addition, there is no real justification for attacking Israel, for striking at Hezbollah in Syria. After all, Hezbollah will have a difficult time justifying their response in defending Syria and not southern Lebanon. When I saw the video of the destroyed vehicles, they were in pieces. One was a Jeep Cherokee, the other a Kia Sorento. These 12 were planning and plotting to attack Israel. It is very impressive that Israel intercepted them, that Israel even knew about the Iranian general, and that his team was so close to their border in 2 vehicles at that moment. That is very superb intel. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know, and I spoke about this earlier, repetition is good. From the Jewish point of view, repeating is how we learn. Not simply by memorizing and repeating, but by reviewing texts and teaching them. The greatest text in Judaism is the Bible. It is by far the foundation, and it is called Mikra, or source. After that comes a text called the Mishnah, and that is the first and primary rabbinic source. The word Mishnah actually means second. It means repeat. It comes from the Hebrew word sheni, or two. Mishnah means repeat, to say it again. Next comes the Gemara, the teachings of the later rabbis after the Mishnah. Together, the Mishnah and Gemara compose the Talmud. When the Gemara cites a source from the earlier Mishnah, it uses the Aramaic word Ditanya, which means it was taught in the Mishnah. You see, we learn and teach and study by reviewing our sources. In Judaism, even the language of learning and teaching reveals the need to learn by way of reviewing previous teachings. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.